In this lesson, we'll learn about Arnold driver and how to save out our renders. In this scene, I'm using the built-in color space to be able to see the results in the picture viewer correctly as we render. To export still frames and animations when you use Arnold for Cinema 4D, you can use the normal Cinema 4D's workflow. Let's go to the render settings and select output. Here you can define the resolution, aspect ratio, and the frame range. We are rendering from frame 100 to 147, which gives us 48 frames or 2 seconds. If we enable saving and go to the save section, you can define where and how you want to save your renders. I have this folder called deleted on my desktop. Let's save it here and type something like turbine for the file name. Instead of this, let's use some simple tokens. I want to create a folder called renders where the current Cinema 4D scene resides. Inside that folder, create another folder with the current Cinema 4D scene or project name, and finally name the render the same as our scene file. Now this scene is called 0604 underscore Arnold underscore driver underscore render output. To do that, simply type in /. Now we are in the folder where the Cinema 4D file is saved. Now we can simply add this project name token by clicking here or simply type $PRJ. Now another /. Now we have created a folder called renders, inside which there will be another folder that will be named based on the current scene name. And finally, let's add another $PRJ, which is going to be the name of the rendered images. So the naming of the renders will be based on the scene file name as well. And then you have your default Cinema 4D save options, format and depth. Down here you have multipass image output, so that's where you can save your AOVs, or what we know it in Cinema 4D as passes. So if I go to my Arnold render tab and choose AOVs tab, I can add the provided AOVs or render passes to my final render. We discuss AOVs later on in this section. For the moment, let's just select the diffuse, specular, and subsurface scattering AOVs and add them to the active AOVs list. So now we are gonna get those AOVs with our beauty pass. We just need to define where we want to save those AOVs or passes. So let's just copy the path for the beauty render and paste it here. So the AOVs will be saved with the beauty pass. Also, let me change the format to something like PNG for the beauty pass and OpenEXR for the AOVs. Now remember, one of the AOVs is the beauty pass, so you don't have to necessarily save out the regular beauty render. You can simply disable the regular image save option up here, but let's have a PNG version as well. And that's it. Now I can simply render my scene using this render to picture viewer button. So the render is done and we can go through the timeline and take a look at it. Now, if I go to the layer tab and change the mode to single pass, I can see different AOVs for each frame. I'm gonna change the mode to image and go back to the history tab. Now let's see where the images are saved out. If I go to the project files folder for this course, the current scene file we are working on is this 0604 Arnold driver render output. Cinema should have created a folder here for us named renders, and here it is. Now if we go inside, we find another folder that is named according to our file name, and each time we basically incrementally save our Cinema 4D file, there will be a new folder here based on that file name. And inside here we should find our render. both for the regular beauty render and the multi-layered EXR file. Now let's delete all of these files and put this folder aside and close the picture viewer. Now, if you take a look at your Object Manager window, you can see when we rendered out our animation, Arnold added a new object named Display Driver. And if I select it and go to the Driver tab, you can see the driver type is set to C4D display. So we are using Cinema 4D's native save options to output our render. And if I expand this driver to see its children, you can see we have access to the individual AOVs that we added a moment ago in our render settings. We can select them and individually control their options. Now, what you see here named as display driver is actually an Arnold driver object, which you can use it to save an output. Let's create a new Arnold driver from Arnold menu. Let's go for the EXR type. Under the driver menu, you can define the format you want to save your output with: deep EXR, EXR, JPEG, PNG, or TIFF, or Cinema 4D display, which we used in the previous render. In this case, let's use EXR. You can alter the filter type for this particular driver by disabling this use default filter option. You can add AOVs specifically to this driver, and for this you can have this enable AOVs checked. Remember, you can have multiple drivers, and when you render out your scene, each driver will save out your render based on the specific settings they have. Let's say I want to have my Z depth and normal AOV saved out from this driver. So click on the setup AOVs button, delete the diffuse, specular, and SSS AOVs from this driver, and let's add Z for Z depth and N for normals. And press OK. So this driver saves out the beauty, Z depth, and normal AOVs. If you enable this merge AOVs option, the AOVs will be saved out in a multi-layer or multi-channel EXR file instead of a separate EXR file for each AOV. So let's have it enabled. We also have this output Arnold denoiser AOVs. If enabled, the render from this driver will be ready to be denoised by Arnold denoiser after the render. So let's check that option as well. Now in the main tab, you can define where you want to save this output using the file path section. We have a few different file path options. If you change this to render settings regular or render settings multipath, the same path and name settings from the render settings regular or multipath save fields will be used. In this case, we use tokens, and if we use render settings regular, for example, this driver will use the same folders and tokens to save out the render. Now we can choose this custom option and use a more manual way of saving out this driver. Let's save it to this deleted folder on my desktop and press save. But because we are rendering a sequence, we need to add padding. So for the name, we can use this output underscore and add probably 3 padding, as we are rendering from frame 100 to 147. And now we can render our scene. Remember, right now, because we are having 2 drivers in the scene, this driver we just created, which is going to render a beauty path, a Z depth, and a normal path in the EXR format. And we still have our display driver, which is going to render the scene using the Cinema 4D save options. And it is going to have the AOVs we have set up in the render settings window. Now let's click on the render to picture viewer and wait for the render. Now in the picture viewer, we can't see the passes from the new Arnold driver that we created. But if I go to the output folder, which was this deleted folder on the desktop, we have these EXR files being rendered from frame 100. And they contain the beauty, Z depth, and normal AOVs from the Arnold driver that we created. And if I go to that render folder inside the project files, you can see the Cinema 4D display driver is rendering the beauty path in the PNG format and the diffuse, specular, and subsurface scattering AOVs in a multi-channel EXR file for each frame. Let me just delete all of these renders again. Now, there might be cases where you only want to render an output using Arnold driver and disregard the renders from Cinema 4D save option, which personally for me is the case all the time. In this case, you need to go to the render settings window and in the save section, change the format to Arnold's driver only, no output. And this way, only the Arnold driver will output your render based on the options you specified there. But you still need to have a file path defined here. Otherwise, Cinema 4D won't start rendering. So let's use that format and disable the multipath save option. Select the Arnold EXR driver again. Now let's change the file path, this time to render settings regular, which will use the file path defined here in the render settings. Now let's start the render again. Now only this EXR driver will save out the renders to that folder. We defined it using tokens. We can go to that folder inside our project files and see the EXR files are being saved out from that Arnold driver. And these contain the beauty paths, Z depth, and normal AOVs. Let me stop the render for now and select that Arnold driver again. And in the main tab, let's take a quick look at some of its important options. Now, these options under the driver tab depends on the driver type you are working with. The current options are specific to the EXR format. If I change the driver to a simple JPEG driver, we will see a simple set of quality slider and a few other options. Let's get back to that EXR again, as this is the mainstream format. You have different standard compression types to manage the file size of your renders. You can read about EXR data compression types on your own. A zip or zip-s are good options. You can use no compression for a lossless render. A half precision will render out a 16-bit EXR file instead of a 32-bit file. A 16-bit render is more than enough in most cases. We have this tiled option, which is enabled by default. And if enabled, Arnold will save out the render buckets one by one as they are rendered, which reduces memory taken up by image buffers. And if turned off, the scanline method will be used, which may work better with composition packages like Nuke or Fusion. In that case, the whole image buffer size will be allocated all at once for all the AOVs present in the scene. You can define a color space for the image output. For example, if you are using ACES, you could use the output sRGB color space here instead of doing it in the Fusion. But normally you want to keep your render in ACES and do the color space conversion in post like we did in the previous lesson. Auto crop removes pixels where alpha and all other channels are 0. This could be useful for compositing, especially if you have a lot of empty space. And you can use this custom attribute section to write out custom EXR metadata using different data types. You can check out these options in more detail in the official user guide. So that's about exporting, render output, and Arnold driver. See you in the next video.